Hi, everybody. I'm Zach Wulderk. I'm a research scientist at Faunalytics, here to talk about our new report on chickens and fishes' beliefs around the world with Courtney from Mercy for Animals.
Hi there, Courtney Dillard, social change researcher at MFA. Excited to be here.
And before we jump into the Q&A part of everything, I'm just gonna give some well, we're gonna give some background on how the study came to be, what it's all about, and some of the results. So in November of 2020, Phonalytics released the first study in this series, which looked at the beliefs people in the US hold about chickens and fishes and how those beliefs are related to pro-animal behaviors. So specifically signing a petition to improve the welfare of those animals and also pledging to reduce the consumption of chicken or fish products. And then in the sort of development stage for the second phase of this, we expanded the scope and worked with MFA on this.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say we were really impressed with the US report, really excited about it. And of course, MFA is focused on smaller bodied animals, chicken and fish. And the idea that we had the potential to offer our global reach with offices in Brazil and India, and interest in Canada and China. That's really what got us excited about it. We could take this really well-developed and designed study and apply it in these other places where, of course, scale is an issue. So many animals are affected in these countries. And so I reached out to Joe Anderson and asked if we might come alongside. And we did the first ever collaboration with Faunalytics. And I know as a research team, we were really excited by it. It was a long project, and we really learned a lot in it. And yeah, felt like that expansion of scope was good for all parties and the movement.
Yeah, and it was truly a wonderful experience working with MFA on this. So yeah, very, very exciting. The US results, so from that first study that we did, aren't necessarily generalizable to other regions of the globe. So in other words, we studied one group of people, but we should be cautious about applying our findings to another group of people. So it's often been the case that research has focused a lot more on countries like the US or countries in Western Europe to the exclusion of the rest of the world. And that means that advocates working in those less studied countries may either have to dismiss much of the existing research because it might not be particularly relevant to them, or try to find ways to apply the findings from populations that might not be especially comparable in a lot of ways. So one of the many, many benefits of partnering with Mercy for Animals is that we were able to take a look at other countries. So in this case, Brazil, China, India, Canada, to provide data and recommendations for advocates working in those countries. And the 4 countries that we focused on for these reports are responsible for almost 30% of the global total of chickens slaughtered each year, and about 20% of the same number for fishes. So really high impact countries in the scheme of global animal slaughter totals. After we consulted with some experts from Mercy for Animals to confirm that all of the questions were culturally relevant, still applying them from the US context to other contexts, we surveyed about 1,000 participants in each country. Those participants were assigned to either a chicken condition or a fish condition, and were then asked to respond to about 30 statements about their assigned animal on a 7-point scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So some of those beliefs are: fish can feel pain, chickens have a lower IQ than most animals, fish don't mind being in a barren environment, chickens can feel positive emotions like pleasure. So a bunch of like differently framed kind of questions, just asking people, how strongly do you agree with this statement? Each of those beliefs was also categorized into a group based on its like general theme. So for example, chickens have a lower IQ than most animals. That's related to intelligence. Chickens or fish can feel pain. That's related to suffering. And then each like individual belief fell under one of 7 themes. So intelligence, suffering, and also emotions, personality, social, consumption. And then we have a sort of catch-all like other category. After we asked participants about those beliefs, we asked them if they'd sign a petition to improve the conditions of their assigned animal, and if they would pledge to reduce their consumption of products that come from their assigned animal. Because a petition isn't as likely to be used in the Chinese context, Chinese participants were asked if they would support improvements to chicken and fish welfare in a more general sense. We analyzed the responses by running correlation tests on participants' beliefs in their pro-animal behaviors, so whether they signed the petition or took the diet pledge. And then what that tells us is whether or not there's any association between holding a certain belief and taking one of those pro-animal actions. So whether a belief and an action tend to go hand in hand. We did this for each specific belief, and then we also took the average for each one of those themes that I mentioned. So all of the beliefs related to chicken intelligence, fish suffering, and so on. And one of the things that I think makes these reports really interesting, in my opinion, is that we have results on a few different things. So how common is each one of those beliefs? What percentage of participants signed a petition? What percentage of participants pledged to reduce their consumption of chicken or fish products? Were people more willing to take pro-fish actions or pro-chicken actions? And all that's before we even get to those associations between beliefs and actions, which can tell us what specific beliefs and more generally what types of beliefs are often associated with pro-animal actions. So in terms of the actual reports themselves, late last month, we published our results in 4 country level reports, so one for each of Brazil, Canada, China, and India, and then also a brief report comparing the results from those countries with the US added in as well. And we've also translated the Brazil report into Portuguese, the China report into simplified Chinese, and the India report into Hindi. And then that comparative report I mentioned has also been translated into each one of those languages. So that's really exciting, a great way to sort of like expand the audience of people who can actually, put these results into action.
Yeah, I really want to just commend you all for doing that as well, so that advocates and really in a wide variety of capacities can make use of the research and not just a handful.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I think something that we're definitely hoping to do more of in the future. There's a lot of information in each of these reports, and I'm going to touch on some of it, but I don't want to just start listing off numbers. I do want to give a few very quickly, just because I think that they're especially interesting. So in our US study, we found that between 30 and 40% of participants took each one of those pro-animal actions, so signing the petition or taking the diet pledge. And in every other country we looked at, the rates were at least a little bit higher, if not considerably higher. In Canada, it was only a little bit higher, 37 to 47%. But in Brazil, it was even higher, 52% to 70%. And everything but the chicken diet pledge had above 60% of people we asked saying yes. India and China had pro-animal action rates above 70%. And even though the participants were asked questions about chickens or fishes, there wasn't any like experimental element designed to try to make them more likely to sign these things, to sign these petitions or to take these pledges. So what that kind of suggests is that people in different countries might have different levels of openness to taking a diet pledge or signing a petition. And in most of the countries that we looked at, that looks like more than half of people saying yes when asked about those, if they would take those actions. So in other words, advocates working in those countries, they might have a fair bit of success by more or less just asking for certain actions. Obviously not everyone will say yes, but a pretty good number might. Which is a really interesting finding. It's something that kind of surprised me.
Mm-hmm.
So advocates who might be interested in seeing how commonplace each of the 30-something beliefs we asked about are should definitely take a look at the reports themselves. Because again, I don't want to just list off numbers for hours, but I wanted to highlight which of the themes of beliefs were most strongly associated with action for each country. So for animal advocates working in those countries, highlighting or emphasizing those types of beliefs could potentially result in more people taking a diet pledge or signing a welfare petition. In Brazil, beliefs about emotions and suffering had the strongest association with all 4 of our actions: the fish pledge, the fish petition, the chicken pledge, and the chicken petition. Some of the strongest examples are beliefs like fish can feel pain, chickens need room to explore and exercise, and most chickens are raised inhumanely. In Canada, beliefs about emotions, again, were a top belief theme in terms of association with all of the actions. Fish can feel positive emotions like pleasure, and chickens are loving were some of the top beliefs. In China, personalities and emotions, beliefs related to those themes were top, had like the strongest average associations with those actions. Some examples: fish are loving, fish can bond with humans, chickens play. And then in India, it was beliefs related to consumption of chickens and fishes that tended to have the strongest association with taking the pledge or signing the petition, but not by a lot. And I think it's worth saying that the correlations in our India study were pretty consistently weak, and that there wasn't too much difference across beliefs. So I don't really know that for advocates working in India, specific beliefs are the most important thing to focus on, or the best way to sort of approach these actions. Instead, it might be more useful for advocates there to evaluate where they've had the biggest impact so far, and continue with those demonstrated results, rather than trying to design campaigns around results that don't necessarily show a clear top theme sticking out. And I should also say that the base rates of petition signatures and diet pledges in India, again, above 70%, they're so high that beliefs might not be as important for advocates as just asking for these kinds of actions, because it seems like the rate of uptake will still be pretty high. And then the last thing that I just wanted to mention is that some of the high level takeaways from these studies, there's visible differences between participants from different countries. So in some countries like China and India, you have 75% of people saying that they'll pledge to consume less chicken or fish. But at the same time, in countries like the US or Canada, that number is only like a third of people we surveyed. So you also see some similar beliefs most strongly associated with taking pro-animal actions, like across countries, but also plenty of different beliefs that are most strongly associated with those actions. So personally, my biggest takeaway from this whole project has been the need for animal advocacy research focused on specific populations, because there can just be so much variation across countries. And we want to make sure that advocates are working with the best information available. And so far, many of the countries that are among the top contributors to global slaughter totals have been understudied. So there's a lot of opportunities for really high impact research there.
Yeah, I was really excited to hear about this, Zach, and not surprised, because I agree with you that we have approached this as in too general of a fashion, and that really understanding that different audiences live in different contexts, have grown up with a different set of beliefs, are surrounded by a different cultural milieu is so important. And I think it's one of the strengths of the movement right now is how we're turning our attention to that. And just like any kind of effort at persuasion, recognizing how important knowing who your audience is, knowing what context they're in, and then making your messages line up with what they care about. And I see this as a great example of us doing that. And then hopefully people will take that information who are on the ground and use it to develop messages that are particular to their populations.
Yeah, all excellent points and very, very well said. And I agree. It's something that I think the movement is moving more in that direction, and very much for the good. Mm-hmm. I think now we're going to move over to the Q&A portion. And the first question that I have here is, what's the biggest misconception about each species, and how can we correct that? Misconceptions about chickens and fishes differ from country to country. So it's not totally clear. There's not one clear answer to this. How can we correct that? Also important. So some of the misconceptions, big fish or chicken farms aren't gross. That's something that came up a lot across countries. Obviously, gross is a subjective term, but in many cases, less than half of participants agreed that big fish farms are gross, or that big chicken farms are gross. In Brazil, just some other examples. In Brazil, less than half of people think that fish experience positive emotions. In Canada, only half of people believe that most farmed chickens are raised inhumanely. In China, many people don't believe that chickens mind being in a barren environment. In India, less than 60% of participants think that chickens and fishes need room to explore or exercise. So there's a bunch of different things that come up in different contexts, which just goes back to what Courtney said so well a couple of minutes ago. the need to sort of focus as much as we can on these different contexts so that we have a better understanding of the people that advocates are working with. And one way of shifting those beliefs is to have like informational campaigns that show those realities, that show the conditions on factory farms, or the rich social lives of chickens and fishes and so on. But another thing that might feel a little bit counterintuitive, I guess, is that we don't always have to prioritize correcting those misconceptions. The correlation results that we found show that just because a belief is common doesn't necessarily mean that it's associated with action. So instead, we can focus more on the beliefs that go hand in hand with those actions, right? Which is why it's important to consider the correlation results in here. There are certain beliefs that may be very common or maybe very uncommon that might have stronger or weaker sort of associations with actually taking action. The next question we have on here is why chickens and fishes? Courtney, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I think you spoke to it a little bit previously when you just talked about how many animals are caught up in the system when we talk about small-bodied animals, right? So about 70 billion chickens slaughtered every year and nearly 100 million tons of fishes, which in and of itself, just the fact that we can only measure by tons says a lot about the way that we regard these animals. And so scale is certainly a primary interest for MFA and I would think for Faunalytics as well. I would also say that from MFA's perspective, prior to coming into this research, we looked around to see what existing literature is out there about how people see these animals. And it's an incredibly understudied area. And of course, perceptions of farmed animals in general is an area that needs more research, but it was striking how many more studies talked about pigs and cows than talked about fish and chicken. And I think there's almost a presumption there that those animals were not going to elicit the same kind of feelings or the same kind of a breadth of recognition of different kind of attributes. So we're very excited to do research to show to get a sense of how people saw these animals and to add to the literature, which was certainly lacking.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like speaking to that scale point, we have a page on the Faunalytics website that has the global animal slaughter statistics over time. And there's like a graph that shows all the different types or many of the different types of farmed animals and the number that have been slaughtered year over year. And in order to fit the chicken line on the graph without it being just a really, really tall, impossible to read graph, we actually had to divide the total of chickens by 1,000 just to get it to fit on the graph in a way that was easy to read. So just speaking to that right. Scale question.
Yeah, and I think that there's research being done right now where we see that some of the moves that people are making in respect to sustainability suggests that they are going to eat chicken and fish instead of larger bodied animals or animals that are more likely to be tied to sustainability issues or global warming specifically. And so even more likely we're going to have more of these animals caught up in the system and therefore more individuals suffering. So I think even more reason to try and better understand how to speak to how people see these animals, because they're going to be more and more in focus as kind of different arguments are put forward, and particularly from a sustainability lens.
Absolutely, yeah, that's an excellent point. The next question that I have here are: what are some ways that advocates who aren't working on petitions or pledges, how can they use the data? Yeah, so for the most part, the percentages of people who said yes to either signing a petition or taking a diet pledge were pretty consistent within countries. So even though those are very different types of asks, those results were still pretty consistent. And because of that, I would expect to see similar results for other types of pro-animal asks. So I think that that's one possibility. By that same kind of logic, beliefs that had the strongest associations with both taking diet pledge and signing the welfare petition may also be associated with other types of asks. So I think if it was true for both of the asks that we used, there's a decent chance that it would probably be applicable to another type of kind of similar ask. Also, petitions are essentially just a way of measuring public support, right? So the data we collected for these studies show the high amount of public support for improved welfare in a lot of cases. And that can be used by a lot of different organizations. You don't have to, redo a public support survey or something like that. If you can just sort of like repurpose the results that Faunalytics and Mercy for Animals got in these studies. And then I guess there's also a lot of information that reports about which beliefs people hold. For example, 93% of Brazilians believe fish are beautiful. That's something that advocates in Brazil might be able to, leverage. 26% of Canadians think chickens are the most ethical animal to eat, which goes back to what Courtney was saying potentially about sustainability. So those are things that people can sort of keep in mind, and that information isn't specifically tied to pledges or petitions and can be used by advocates working on any sort of campaign. The next question I have here is a really good one. Why do you think the rates of signing petitions and taking pledges are so much higher outside of the US and Canada? Courtney?
Well, I mean, I think that whatever answer I offer is speculative, of course. But I think we've seen some of this in other kind of cross-country research we've done, our multinational survey research that we're just getting findings on now that has responses from 23 different countries. One of the thoughts I have, and of course I need to do some research to better evidence this, is that it's just there might be a little fatigue for these kinds of things in countries, the US and Canada, where people have been asked to do, a lot of change.org petitions or, those kinds of Meatless Monday pledges or what have you. I do think that concepts and activism need to remain kind of novel and interesting. And if we're just kind of coming back to the same old activities that people have been asked to do over and over again, we might not get that same uptake as in countries where these are newer activities and therefore more interesting, fewer people are asking people to do that. So that's just one thought I have. I think probably, Zach, you thought about a little bit about this as well.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point and not something that I had thought of. I think there's also, of course, cultural differences, maybe, and that's sort of like one of those cultural differences, I guess. They could definitely, there's like so many possibilities under that sort of cultural differences umbrella, so it's hard to speak to any of them in particular. I think one way to sort of see that might be like that the US and Canada had pretty similar results to each other, not exactly the same, but pretty similar. And US and Canada are predominantly English speaking countries, they're neighbors. So kind of like a shared culture in some sense there, and similar results. But these other countries that are in different parts of the world, speak different languages, have their own sort of cultures that are less similar to the US and Canada's. I think that's one possible chance for like the source of why there's so much difference. There's a chance that it's methodological. So we ran our India survey in English after consulting with a researcher from India, but English, and we did that because there are so many languages spoken in India, and those languages are different in different parts of the country. And English has a good kind of cross section, but English isn't often a first language there, so that may have impacted the results. It's also possible that participants in different countries interpreted different questions differently. So like they may have had different interpretations of certain words. It might not be possible to perfectly translate certain ideas across languages and so on. So there's a lot of possibilities. The ones that I mentioned and definitely the one that Courtney mentioned as well, I think are pretty good guesses for what's driving it, but it could be a lot of different things. And the last question I'm seeing right now is, are you doing any kind of follow-up research based on these findings? Yes. Faunalytics is currently working on a project that follows up on this research and uses it in an experimental design. The results in these reports are correlational rather than causal. So in other words, we can observe that certain beliefs and pro-animal actions go hand in hand, but we can't say for sure whether those beliefs are what's causing those actions. The study we're currently working on will let us do that. Just be a sort of like stronger study, I think, in terms of causality. And essentially, we're looking to answer the questions, when people believe that chickens are smarter than they previously thought, or that fish experience emotions, how does that change their other beliefs, and how does that change their pro-animal behavior? Are they more willing to take pro-animal actions, like, again, signing a pledge or taking a pledge or signing a petition? And the results from that will help advocates figure out, what they may want to focus on in their campaigns in order to generate the kind of change that they want to see.
Yeah, and I think MFA would be happy to be involved in anything that you all are doing in the future. And I just think, as a researcher, this is exactly what I would see the movement benefiting from, right? Doing this kind of first level survey research, and then doing experimental research, and then finding avenues to make sure that advocates and the people who are strategizing with the limited resources our movement has, that they're using that to get the best messages for the best people, right? To make the most that are most likely to have them do the actions that we are looking for them to do. And so it's really exciting when we see really robust, thoughtful research in this area follow this step-by-step process. And what I'm really glad about is that we're also getting a lot smarter about doing things like this Facebook Live event, where the people who need to know about these research findings can then take them and utilize them. And so I'm excited about the experimental aspect of this research. That I think it will only strengthen some of the recommendations. And yeah, I'm particularly hopeful that those findings will land in a place where they can be put to best use.
Yeah, and I should say the experimental study that we're working on now is focused specifically on the U.S. So I think we'd also really like to, in the future, us or any other organization, like to sort of like expand that scope, like we were saying, to make sure that we have that information for advocates working in other countries, so that they can have the best information to inform those decisions that Courtney was talking about. So yeah, that's the last question that I see right now. So I just want to thank everybody for coming, for joining us, and I believe Jenna will be linking the study page hub in the comments. There's a bunch of different links in there, again, in a bunch of different languages, which is really exciting. So check out that page, and you can also see Faunalytics' upcoming original studies at faunalytics.org/research-in-progress. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It was a pleasure to be here. And again, very, very much a pleasure to work with Faunalytics on this project.
Yes, absolutely agreed.